In this lesson, we're going to look at the breathing system. So the breathing system, or respiration, is basically how we take in oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide out of our body, and then also as well how we release energy from food. So with respiration, there are two types of respiration. So respiration. You have internal respiration. Okay, and internal respiration takes place in the cell. So we have a cell. Okay, it has the nucleus, and then it has this thing called the mitochondrion. Okay, and internal respiration takes place here in this mitochondrion. So the mitochondrion, and if we remember, in order for respiration to happen, we need glucose, which is C6H12O6, plus oxygen, which is O2, and that will give us CO2, carbon dioxide, plus H2O, which is water, plus energy. So this is what's called respiration, internal respiration. And what's happening here is the body, so through the digestive system, we get glucose. Through the breathing system, we get oxygen. And then we create this waste in the body, which is called carbon dioxide. And then we also produce some water vapor as well that we have to breathe out through the breathing system. So we have water vapor. So this is internal respiration. It's called internal respiration because it happens inside the cell. So this is the cell. So the digestive system helps us to get glucose to the mitochondrion, and then the mitochondrion then takes oxygen that's taken in through the breathing system, and it burns these two together, and it produces a waste, which is CO2, which goes back into the blood, and we have to breathe it out. And it also produces excess H2O water, which is waste, and then it also produces energy as well. So if you breathe onto a cold surface, for example, you will get condensation on that cold surface, like if you breathe onto glass, and that H2O is coming from this chemical reaction that is called respiration. So that's internal respiration. And then what you have is you have the other kind, which is external respiration. And this is what we commonly call breathing. And it's that mechanical process that involves the lungs. And so for example, the lungs, the nose, and mouth. And then you have the diaphragm, which is a massive muscle that's underneath your rib cage. So this is external respiration, and this is like the mechanisms. And the reason for this external respiration is gaseous exchange. Gas exchange with the environment. So what gas is being exchanged with the environment? Well, you have oxygen going in, and then you've carbon dioxide and water vapor going out. Okay, so this is what we mean by gaseous exchange, and this is what's called external respiration. And what happens is the breathing system interacts with the circulatory system. And so, for example, the CO2, so for example, the glucose, C6H12O6, O6 and the O2 has to go into the cell, and it gets there through the bloodstream. Okay, so they get there through the bloodstream, and then when the waste is produced, so when this waste here is produced, the H2O, the CO2, and the H2O is also taken away by the bloodstream as well. Okay, so you get this interaction between the respiratory system and the circulatory system. So that's kind of just a very high level overview of what we're going to look at now in this lesson. So respiration then. So like respiration is the release of energy from food. So we take in glucose and we take out energy from the glucose. This energy is needed for movement, growth, and to produce heat in the body. So for example, if you take the human body, it has to move, it needs energy. This is where it gets its energy from. It also has to grow, so therefore it needs energy. It gets its energy from this process. And it also has to keep the body at an optimal temperature. And that heat that you feel all over your body is the heat is being produced by this process inside the cells in here through respiration. And the heat has been moved all around your body through the blood plasma. The blood pumps all around the body, and it takes the heat all around the body as well. So you have two types then of respiration. So you have the internal and external respiration, and then you have what's known as anaerobic respiration. So anaerobic respiration doesn't need oxygen. Okay, and then you have aerobic respiration, which requires oxygen. Okay, so the body can get energy from glucose, for example, through using oxygen or through another process where they don't use oxygen. And where it uses oxygen, it's called aerobic respiration, and then where it does not use oxygen, it's called anaerobic respiration. So the breathing system is known as the respiratory system as it takes in oxygen needed for respiration. So the lungs, for example, in this breathing system, it takes in this gas that we need. The respiration system removes carbon dioxide from the body and takes in oxygen. This is called gas exchange. That's what we mean by a gaseous exchange. So when you're breathing in and out all the time, you're breathing in oxygen and you're breathing out carbon dioxide. So the oxygen that you breathe in, it's brought to your cells. It goes into the mitochondrion, okay, and then cellular respiration happens. When you eat, the glucose from the food that you eat is brought to the mitochondrion as well, and respiration happens and energy is released. And then the waste product, which is water vapor and CO2, is brought back to the lungs and you breathe it out. So that's what's known as respiration. So that's internal respiration. And then we have this external respiration, and we want to look at this now and the mechanisms of it. So it's important that you know all these parts. So if we think about, first of all, the function of the parts, so we think about the parts of the respiratory system and the function of each part. So the first part then is the mouth. Okay, so the mouth is here, and its function of the mouth is to take in oxygen, and the same with the nose as well. The nose also as well, or the nasal cavity, has hairs and mucus, and what that does also is it filters the air and it takes out dust and microbes and stops it from getting down into the lungs. So then what you have is you have this long tube that goes down to each lung, and that's what's known as the trachea. So the trachea carries air to the lungs and it's kept open by rings of cartilage. So essentially the trachea, it's this long muscular tube. Now, if it was just a muscular tube, it has the potential to close. So what the body has developed is you have these rings of cartilage. So if you feel your trachea at the front of if you feel your throat, you can feel your windpipe. It's the windpipe or trachea, that's what it's called. And you'll feel the rigid lumps of cartilage that are in there. So it's essentially cartilage and muscle. And the cartilage function is to keep the airway open. Then what you have is it breaks off into two parts, and you have what are called the bronchus, and the function of the bronchus is to carry air to each of the lungs. Then what happens is they break down into further branches, which are called the bronchiole, and these are smaller air pipes that carry air to the alveoli. So they branch off further in each lung, And what happens is you go to these little, what are called alveoli, and they are what are known as these tiny little air sacs. So the alveoli, then, the air sacs, are surrounded by capillaries that allow the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So, for example, the oxygen that needs to get into the body, that gets in through the breathing system, but it gets into the blood through these little air sacs called the alveoli. And then the opposite happens then as well. The CO2 that the body has to get rid of, it's taken out of the blood and put into the air sacs, and then we breathe it back out through the breathing system. Then underneath here you have this huge muscle, which is called the diaphragm. So the muscle underneath the lungs that contracts during inhalation. So when you inhale, it contracts. When you exhale, it expands. And if you ever got winded, if you ever got hit in the stomach playing sport, for example, what's probably happened is your diaphragm has been hit and it's gone into spasm. And then what you have is if you feel, so you have your rib cage, and then if you feel in between each of the ribs, you have these muscles called intercostal muscles. And they're the muscles between the ribs, and they contract during inhalation as well. So the purpose of those intercostal muscles is to allow the rib cage to expand and contract. So these are the parts of the breathing system, and it's important that you're able to label all the parts and then that you know the function of each part. So now what we want to think about is like what happens when we breathe, for example. So you have the inhalation step and you have the exhalation step. So one way to kind of think about it is if you think about the diaphragm and the rib cage, what happens to it? Well, when you inhale, you are taking in air from the outside. So what happens is we want to expand the chest cavity, and we also want to expand the diaphragm. So what will happen is the diaphragm will go down, and as a result of this, it will expand the lungs, and then the lungs will suck in air. When we exhale, the opposite happens. So the diaphragm will contract, okay, or it moves up. And what that does is it reduces the air, the volume of air that's in the lungs, or it compresses the lungs. The rib cage will also compress as well. The intercostal muscles will compress. And what that will do is it will squeeze the air, it'll squeeze the air out of the lungs. So you have this air, so this is when you're inhaling, you inhale oxygen, and when you're exhaling carbon dioxide. So inhalation needs energy because this muscle has to move down here. Whereas exhalation is passive, it doesn't need any energy, it's just a process that happens after inhalation. So what happens then is the brain detects a rise in carbon dioxide in the blood. So basically, there's a rise in this carbon dioxide level in the blood. A nerve impulse from the brain causes the diaphragm and intercostal muscles to contract. The diaphragm moves down and the rib cage moves out. So this is what happens here. And the chest volume increases. Air pressure inside the chest decreases. So this allows the air from the outside to come in. And air enters in through the nose and the mouth into the lungs. And then the opposite of that happens when we exhale. So then we want to think about like what happens. So when the oxygen has, the oxygen has gone down through the lungs and it gets down into this air sac, which are called alveoli. So basically what happens here is this process of gas exchange. So you have oxygen being exchanged with carbon dioxide. So diffusion is the movement of molecules from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. The walls of the alveoli and the capillaries are thin to allow easy movement of oxygen. So this is the wall of the alveoli, so it's really thin, it's only like 1 cell thick. And then this is the wall of the capillaries as well. So the capillaries are very, very thin, fine molecules. And the reason they're so thin is it allows gas exchange, it allows oxygen to move across and into the blood, and then it allows CO2 to move from the blood back into the air sac. So oxygen moves from the alveolus to the red blood cells in the capillaries and combines with the hemoglobin. So what happens is when we breathe, the oxygen comes down here, comes into the lung, it diffuses across these membranes and it attaches onto the red blood cells to this substance called hemoglobin that allows the red blood cells to soak up the oxygen. Carbon dioxide then, on the other hand, is taken from the body, like from the cells, for example, when respiration happens, and it's brought to the alveoli. It passes across these membranes into the air sac, and then we breathe out and we breathe it out. So carbon dioxide moves from the blood plasma to the alveolus. So we have this process of what's called diffusion, and the way to kind of think about it is, imagine there's a lot of like oxygen, and it's all cramped in like this into a tight space. So what we can say is that, so this is oxygen O2, we can say that here it's high concentration. Okay, so there's a lot of it that's all packed in together. And what's going to happen is these individual oxygen molecules will bump against each other, and they will move from an area of high concentration, and they'll actually spread out. And they'll move into whatever space is available for them to move in. So this is like space. And this is an area of low concentration. And we mean low concentration of O2. So high concentration of O2, low concentration of O2. So it's like a packed room, so the people will want to move out into space because they're all bumping against each other. So this is what we call diffusion. And this is what happens here. So this, for example, what will happen is what you will get basically is you'll have, so for example, the oxygen here, let's say in this space here, from here all along here, it's going to be like in an area of high concentration. So it'll be high concentration, let's say here on this side. And then here on this side, it's going to be low concentration. So what will happen is the oxygen will just want to move across this membrane into this area where there's space for it to move. Okay, so it's diffusing from high concentration here to low concentration inside the blood, inside the capillary. And inside the capillary, you can think about, so you have these red blood cells, and they're kind of like a donut shape. So these are red blood cells. And what they will do is they're like sponges, and they absorb, imagine these are oxygen molecules, it basically absorbs all the oxygen. And the oxygen is attached onto this substance that's in the blood called hemoglobin. And it literally sticks on to the red blood cells, and then the red blood cells then bring the oxygen around the body to the cells where respiration can happen. Now then what's going to happen then from the body, then you're going to get this waste CO2 that's going to be produced. So the waste CO2, and this is going to come in the blood plasma. And what will happen is it'll come from, so imagine all here, there's going to be, so all in here, you're going to have a high concentration of CO2. And then in here, there's going to be a low concentration. So what will happen is the CO2 will diffuse into this space here. And then what will happen is when you breathe out, this brings it to the lungs, and then you breathe it out and you get it out of the body because it's waste and it's toxic to the body, CO2. So that's the process of what's called gas exchange. So you get this exchange of gases inside the alveoli. So oxygen enters red blood cells in the alveoli in the lungs. Blood high in oxygen is carried back to the heart and the pulmonary vein. Okay, the heart pumps oxygenated blood all around the body through the aorta and other arteries. The bloodstream collects digested food from the small intestine, and capillaries carry blood high in oxygen and food to the blood cells. So all those nutrients of oxygen and the digested food has been brought to the cells where respiration can happen. Food and oxygen enters the body cells by diffusion, and waste such as carbon dioxide move from body cells into the bloodstream. So that's what we can see here that is happening. So blood high in carbon dioxide and low in oxygen returns to the heart and through the vena cava, and the heart pumps the blood to the lungs to allow gas exchange to happen. And this is what we've talked about here. So you have this interaction between the digestive system, the breathing system, and the circulatory system. It's how they all interact with each other. So that is the breathing system, and then that is how it interacts with the circulatory system and the digestive system.